Hey, this is Joe Gilder from Home Studio Corner. Welcome to Mix Together Season 4, Episode 2. Today we're going to dive into the mix a little bit further. In the last episode, in case you missed it, we took our tracks, we imported them into our session, organized them, and started our static mix. Now, you can do this along with me. Just look in the description. There's a link that'll show you how to download these tracks and import them into your own session, regardless of what software you use, and you can mix along with me. I'll be using Studio One for Personas. You can use whatever software you want, and you can follow right along. I promise it's actually going to be pretty easy. By the way, this whole season is sponsored by our buddies at Sweetwater Sound. If you've not shopped at Sweetwater, you should give them a shot. I used to work there. Tells you what kind of a classy place that is. And their salespeople are super knowledgeable. They've got a warehouse the size of a small town, which means they're going to have what you want in stock most likely. Fast shipping, tons of great service after the sale. And here's a bonus thing I love about Sweetwater. They have a cable finder on their website. You know when you've got that particular connection and you're trying to find the right cable for it? They've got a little system on their website that'll help you find it. Just search up cable finder at sweetwater.com. And if you're thinking, I need an XLR male to TRS male cable, and it'll say, doink, here are all the XLR male to TRS cables. It's super handy because, searching through, they carry lots of different brands. Being able to hone it down and see the length and the brand right there is super great. I use this all the time when I'm looking for specific cables, so go check it out. All right, let's get into the mix. Where we left off last week, I had done a good chunk of my static mix, and what that means is I haven't used any plugins yet. I've just set some levels, and a lot of folks have commented, or a handful of folks have commented on the fact that I've used these trim knobs across the top of the channels rather than using the faders for this first initial setting of levels, or you may call it gain staging. I don't use that term because it means a lot of different things. I just wanted to get the level in the ballpark of where I wanted it. That's it. Just a big, rough, knuckle dragger Neanderthal moves just to get the levels roughly where I want them, right? I don't want to have to bring my fader way down here to get the level that I need for this overhead. I want it to all kind of be around zero. Now we're going to kind of be more creative, actually maybe listen to the entire song and move some faders around and play around with our levels. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mute the lead vocal. Now, this is just a personal preference. You don't have to do this, but generally speaking, a lead vocal, and we can hear the one here, there's nothing wrong with it. She always said she would. It's going to need some EQ. It's going to little on the muddier side. We're going to do a lot of things to that. To my ear, this vocal doesn't really, the vocals in general, lead vocals, whether it's my song or somebody else's, doesn't really fit in the song until we've done some processing to it. So for the majority of kind of doing my static mix, and even when I get into mixing, I'm going to mix it like an instrumental for a while and bring the vocal in later. So I'm going to do that now, mute the lead vocal because it's just going to distract us and get in the way. We'll bring it back in later. So let's go into our session. Let's bring it back to the very beginning. And I'm going to hit play, mute my microphone, and I'm just going to move faders. You can see what I'm doing, and then we'll kind of see where we are after I've played back the song. And if we're ready to jump into step 3 of my 5-step mix process, I'll explain more about that in a second. For now, let's listen. In case you're wondering, I just narrowed the view. It's just a view thing, so I can just see all the faders on one screen. That's all I did.
lost if I succumb to a long distance voodoo. She has a new life, just 3 hours from me. No Hollywood Elle, just wanted to disappear. Oh, Elle, where did you go? Miss your laugh, how your eyes will glow. Now everyone's looking for Elle. Everyone's wondering where she is. Everyone's looking for Elle. Where are you? Now everyone's looking for Elle. She's on that. Everyone's looking for Elle. Where are you? Now everyone's looking for Elle. Everyone's wondering where she is. Everyone's looking for Elle. Where are you?
Oh, yeah. So I took back what I said and brought the vocals back in because I just missed having them. Turned them down a little bit, just the vocal bus, so they weren't super loud. I'm going to want them loud and on top of the mix later, but it just felt naked without the vocal, and I take back what I said. See, this is the thing, by the way. If you are looking for a mixing tutorial that is pristine, where I, the teacher, never makes a mistake, you're going to want to go ahead and move on to somewhere else. I don't think A, that's realistic, or B, that's very helpful. If you watch someone who never messes up and who never backtracks, then whenever you mess up and backtrack, you'll assume there's something fundamentally wrong with you. There's not. I thought I wanted to go through without the vocal. I got about 60 seconds in and said, shoot, no, I want the vocal, and I turned it back on. We're going to do that a lot over this series. I'm going to try things. I'm going to say, well, crap, that didn't work. And we're going to undo it and move back and try something else, okay? That's the name of the game here. One quick thing here, the lead guitar, you can see it's a lot louder on this last section than the rest of the song. I liked the level we had, like here.
Just 3 hours from me.
But then it feels too loud here. I want it to be louder. We can do automation. For now, I'm just going to use the ability just to adjust the actual gain itself of the waveform. Actually, you know what? Here's a quick for you Studio One folk. The gain envelope is a kind of a destructive volume adjustment without having to slap it or cut it up into two different pieces of audio. I can just bring that one down maybe 5 decibels. That feels more like an appropriate level. We can do volume automation later. I don't like to do much of that at this point, but that was just one spot where everything else, if we just look like visually at the waveform blobs as we go through, they're all pretty consistent all the way through the song. See, the bass is roughly the same volume. These guitars are the same volume. All these guitars are the same volume. It was just this one guy right here. If I undo, you'll see just way louder than the others. Not a problem, no sonic issues there. I heard it and then I saw it visually, so I'm going to fix it there. That's going to make our life a lot easier. So we're not constantly turning the guitar up here and then turning it back down there with the fader, which is just going to keep breaking things. Okay, so real quick summary of my 5-step mix process, which, by the way, you can access at 5stepmix.com. It's a free download. I know you've already entered your email to get the tracks for this thing, but that's also something else you can get. I'll send you the email with the download. You'll be great. But to summarize, step 1 is setting things up. So a lot of the way that I set things up, I talk about there with the folders and the buses and the routing, and also doing some phase checking and things like that. Step 2 is the static mix, which is what we're working on now, which is just let's see how good we can get this thing to sound with no plugins, okay? So step 2 is just about done. This feels pretty good. One of the ways that I know that is about here in the song. When this chorus came on again,
Now everyone's looking for Elle.
I started singing along to it. Everyone's looking for Elle. It's such a catchy melody. And that is an indicator to me that something special's happening. If the mix was really jacked up, I probably wouldn't feel like singing along. Does that make sense? But because we've got the levels balanced out pretty well and it's feeling really good, it made me want to kind of dance in my chair, my squeaky chair, and sing along. So that tells me whenever that happens, if you get goosebumps, if you start singing, you start dancing, pay attention to what your body's doing. That's kind of your body telling you, hey, this is sounding pretty good. Don't miss it. Because we could sit here and do more static mixing for the next 60 minutes if we want, but we're actually pretty much there because we've gone through and set the levels, but also because it's connecting with us on some sort of emotional, physical level, which is arguably a little bit woo-woo, but you know what I mean. You're a musician. If you're watching this, you're already a little bit woo-woo anyway. So welcome to the woo-woo club. All right, so step 2 is the static mix. What is step 3? Well, let me go step 3, 4, and 5 real quick. Step 3 is fix big problems. Step 4 is top-down mixing, and then step 5 is the to-do method for how to get it finished. Top-down mixing, step 4, that's where we're going to spend most of our time. You would think that's where we go next, but actually, we're going to go to step 3, which makes more sense because we're going to fix some of the glaring problems before we do top-down mixing. I'll explain top-down mixing a little more later. It's basically where we're going to focus on the buses. I just sounded real southern just then. We're going to focus on the buses, where we're going to focus on the buses themselves, like get our drum mix and then look at the individual tracks. So top-down, mix the bus first, then mix the individual channels if needed. Okay, does that make sense? So we'll get to that in a second, but first, we might not even get to that in this video, depending on how long it takes us to do step 3, which is fix big problems. Kind of the glaring things that we heard as we were doing our static mix, the things we kept kind of biting our finger to not fix until we'd finished our static mix. And for me, one of the big ones is there's something going on with the snare drum. There's a big, thick whoop whoop there that gives me a headache. So we're going to go in and figure out where that's happening and fix it. Now, it could be happening on several channels. Could be on the snare drum track and also on the overhead, maybe on other tracks, I don't know. But we're going to identify where it is, then we're going to fix it. So big part of knowing what to work on is what stands out. So just listen to the snare drum in this whole mix real quick. The snare's got some thickness, which I like, but it's got this full, sort of it gives me a headache. That's the best way I can explain it. Kick drum might need a little work too, but the biggest issue right now is snare, so we're going to deal with the snare. So let's just listen to the drums for a second and see if we can learn anything from listening. So that snare, whoa, 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 that needs to go down. Now, where is the problem happening? We can find that one of two ways. We can solo things one at a time, or we can listen to the overall drums and take things away or mute things until the problem disappears. Let's see where the problem is. So we'll start with everything, and first I'll take away the top snare mic. That's really interesting. You would think that would be the bulk of the problem, right? I took the top snare mic away and it didn't change all that much. Here's what the top snare sounds like by itself. It's not even that loud in the mix. So where is the craziness coming from? Is it the bottom snare? Okay, a bunch of the sound went away when I removed the bottom snare. Now let's remove the overhead. Okay, being that these are virtual drums, there's no bleed anywhere else. So our culprits today, I think, are twofold. They're the bottom snare mic and the overhead. That overhead does sound good though. So let's figure out, let's just get rid of them one at a time and see which version sounds better, then we can kind of work on fixing one of them. Okay. I like what the overhead's doing. I think it needs to be EQ'd a little bit. Sometimes you can view the overhead as your cymbals mic. Sometimes you miss out on cool vibes if you do that. So let's just listen to the culprits. The three making up our snare sound in this mix are the snare top, snare bottom, and the overhead. Let's listen to those for a second. I didn't do a good job of setting the balance on these two. Let me get those real quick. Did you hear that whistle in my tooth? I was turning up the snare bottom because I assumed it would be the brighter of the two. I should have listened to it more closely because it's actually got a lot of that low end to it. So let's reset some of these levels here and just kind of quickly reset the levels of these two. Okay, that level sounds better. I feel like we got kind of the best of both worlds there. I'm going to address the issue on the snare bottom to start, because if we listen again, now that we've turned that snare top up, never mind. The snare is on both the top and the bottom snare. The reason I'm kind of avoiding messing with the overhead for now is I feel like it's got just a cool vibe I want to maintain, and so I want to fix some of this on the individual snare tracks. Now what I'm going to do here, since they both have some of that ring in them, I'm going to actually add a bus for these selected channels. Just call it capital S for snare, and I'm going to put my EQ on this bus. So both snares are now running through this snare bus, and that's the thing we're going to EQ now. So we're going to go find that frequency. My guess, it's around 120 to 150 hertz or so. So that's it. If that gave you a headache, that's what I'm hearing in my head when I listen to these snare drums. So let's narrow that out a little bit and let's just pull that down. That was at 169 hertz or thereabouts. So let's pull that down and see how it sounds. Now, we're not done with the snare. I think the snare still needs some overall EQ to make it really pop, but that big problem is no longer standing out. Let's listen to the whole drums and see if it's still there. Okay, now I'm going to copy that EQ over to the overheads and apply just a little bit there to tame them a little bit. So we'll solo the overheads and do that. Just a little bit in both areas, and I like that rather than doing it on the drum bus, because it's really just a problem on those tracks. The snares and the overhead have that little bit of a build, and I don't want to bust them together because I may do some separate things to each one later, but overall this feels like an improvement to the drums. I'm going to flip the plugins on and off here so you can hear a difference. You hear that? Without the plugins, it's kind of this whoa, 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 and it gives you a headache after a while. Like I literally have it. I do it every time. I get this headache in the back of my head underneath that little knot right there. I'm getting that from the snare drum when that EQ's gone. Drums aren't perfect, but that big issue is gone. If I zoom back out and listen to the whole mix, that snare is no longer standing out as this big problem child. I'm happy. There's no other big problems other than I would maybe do a little bit of EQ on this lead vocal.
Blue. We miss your laugh, your smile, your eyes, your glow.
But I'm going to kind of overhaul the vocals later. So I typically exclude lead vocal from this step 3 just because it's going to need a pretty aggressive amount of compression and some EQ and maybe some effects as well before it sounds like I want it to sound. The vocal, typically when I'm mixing, it's the one that gets the biggest change, like from raw vocal to finished vocal. There's a pretty big difference there. Everything else, it's more differing shades of difference. Like right now, the EQ that we did on the drums, nothing huge and earth-shattering, but worthwhile and fixed that big problem that we had there. All right, cool. We're transitioning into step 4, which is top-down mixing, which is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And I'm going to start it with the console shaper inside of Studio One. So this is like, it applies to the entire mix and changes kind of as if you were swapping out mixing consoles on your board. So if you're a Persona Sphere member, you've got access to CTC1, which gives you basically 3 different consoles to mess with. And if you move the controls, it switches between. So if you have something like the Virtual Console Collection from Slate, or there's a few, I don't know all the plugins. I know maybe Waves has some. This is the part where I would add that just to hear how's it doing on my static mix. Which version of the mixer do I like the best? Let me dial in tones just very briefly. Pick one that sounds pretty cool, and then just roll with it. So I'm gonna set it to around 6 here. I'll set the crosstalk to like there, and I'll leave everything else alone for now, and just switch between the 3. See which one I like, and then go from there.
Miss your laugh. Now everyone's looking for Elle. Everyone's praying she's on that. Everyone's looking for Elle. Where are you? Now everyone's looking for Elle. Everyone's wondering where she is. Everyone's looking for Elle. Where are you? Now everyone's looking for Elle. Everyone's praying she's on that. Everyone's looking for Elle. Where are you? Now everyone's looking for Elle. Everyone's wondering where she is. Everyone's looking for Elle. Where are you?
All right, that is probably the hardest thing to demonstrate over YouTube. So hopefully you could hear some of the differences there. It's just overall, it's an overall character thing. In the past, historically, I've chosen this one as the one that I like. But today, I think I'm going to lean towards the tube one, partly because it says tube, and partly because I think I like the kind of little bit of brightness that it gave to something that feels like it's a fairly mid-rangey sound. And if you saw me reaching over here, I'm switching between different speakers. I've got my normal set of monitors, which are a set of Personas monitors, and then my old M-Audio EX66 big honking speakers, and I'm switching between them. They're completely different sounding speakers. And while they have varying degrees, like the mid-range isn't nearly as pronounced on the big speakers, but I wanted to see how it sounded, and I liked the tube setting on both, so I'm going to stick with tube, and we're going to call that a day. Now, we could get into tweaking and turning these knobs even more, but for now, I'm kind of happy with what this is doing, and I'm going to leave it alone. Let me see if these do anything real quick, and then I'll stop.
Now everyone's looking for Elle. Everyone's praying she's on that. Everyone's
Honestly, not quite sure what that does. I'm just going to leave it where it was because I like the sound I'm getting. So that's like a plugin that runs kind of under the hood. It's happening across all the buses and all the channels. It's as if we ran these channels through an analog board with a certain character, and that's what we're getting there. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to leave that alone for now. Now, what is top-down mixing? Let me explain it really quickly. I've said it already, but just so we're all clear, we start at the top. The very, very top is the final mix, the stereo mix, our main output. Then below that, if we're thinking like an organizational chart at a company, The CEO up here, that's the final mix. Then like the senior vice presidents, those are the individual buses. So if I were to actually, let's do this. If I were to just hide audio tracks and just show buses, these, aside from that one, these are our like senior vice presidents, okay? First, I focus on the main bus, which we've already started with CTC1. Then I focus on the individual buses, and then I zoom out further to focus on the individual tracks as well. Does that make sense? And the idea here is, what if, and the golden standard is, what if I can just put a plugin on the main mix that makes everything better, and I don't have to do anything else? It's never happened, but that's the idea. And then it goes to, okay, but what if I just do a little bit of processing on the individual buses? Could that be enough to call it a final mix? And that sometimes happens on certain channels, but then we zoom into the individual channels. Now, why work that way versus the other way? Because the other way gets you into trouble more. This way forces you to zoom out and listen to the whole mix, or at least listen to entire groups of tracks, rather than honing in on the individual channels. I've said this so many times. If you've heard this from me all the time, I apologize for the repetition. But when I first started mixing, I would pull up the kick drum, mix the kick drum. Then pull up the snare drum, mix the snare drum. Then pull up the hi-hat, mix the hi-hat. And I would go through the whole song like that. And I would get to the end, and it didn't sound very good because I had mixed everything kind of in this silo by itself, sort of, and then expected it all to work together. That's not how it works. What works is mixing in context with everything else. And one way that I found to do that helps me not over-mix, which I think is the biggest thing that can plague us in the studio when it comes to mixing, is to go top down, or I used to call it backwards mixing, where I start at the bus and I work my way back. So let's pull up what I have here on my main mix bus as this video is coming to a close, and let's see what kind of sound I can get by just adjusting this compressor and this EQ. This is kind of a classic British style compressor that is great on mix buses, so that's what I'm using. We'll dial that in first, and then we'll do the EQ, okay? Here we go.
Now everyone's looking for red. Everyone's praying she's on that. Everyone's looking for red. Where are you?
Big piece of advice when you're setting up things like this, get a setting that you like and then click it on and off and make sure it's the same volume roughly so you can really tell if you're making a good change or not.
Now everyone's looking for red. Everyone's praying she's on that. Everyone's looking for red. Where are you? Now everyone's looking for red. Everyone's wondering where she is. Everyone's looking for red. Where are you?
Okay, real quick, what did I do? Real simple 2-to-1 ratio, 30 millisecond attack, 100 millisecond release on my mix bus. And it's just barely moving, really just with the kick drum, okay? And then on the EQ, a little bit of a boost in the 360 range, which just tends to make it a little bit warmer. I'll bring that down just a little boost at 7K, a little boost in the top end, which is I think around like 15K or so. And then I just left the low end alone for now. And just adjusted to make sure it's kind of giving me the same volume before and after. And now I'm going to click this on and off and listen to what it does. It takes this from unmixed to already sounding pretty mixed, and we got one plugin with an EQ and a compressor on it. That's the kind of that to me, that's really exciting because look what we're able to do with just this. Now imagine if we do some customization on the buses, how great it's going to sound. Then we may only need to do a little bit of tweaking on the individual channels, and we're able to keep the song intact, keep it sounding great, and without risking over mixing it. So listen to what happens when I turn this on and off. Listen to, even though it's not huge amounts of adjustments, it has tightened things up. The low end feels fuller, and it's a little crisper and a little more full, and it sounds a little more like a mix.
Now everyone's looking for red. Everyone's praying she's on that. Everyone's looking for red. Where are you? Now everyone's
never get tired of this. I know it's not a huge difference, and it's probably tempting to crank up those high frequencies. You don't want to do that. We just want to add a little bit of crispness so the cymbals and the acoustic guitars and the background vocals feel a little brighter. A little bit of that mid-range so everything kind of just mushes and glues together. And then that compression just tightens up the low end a little bit so it just feels a little more like we're used to hearing mixes with a nice tight kind of pulled together low end. Okay, so I could talk for hours about what happened here, but we're going to keep moving forward. But hopefully you're seeing how these different steps of the process play into each other. We set things up, obviously, then we get a static mix first before using plugins so that we can then put plugins on our mix bus, and it's going to make sense because we fixed problems. That kind of EQ thing on the snare was going to mess up the bus compressor, but now the bus compressor can do its work because it's receiving a good sounding balanced mix. And that means we may have to do a little bit less compression, a little bit less EQ on the remaining tracks because we've already got this one in place. This is a great start to the mix. I'm always worried at this point that I'm going to jack things up, but I'm feeling pretty good about it so far. Can't wait to dive in to more top-down mixing next in episode 3. I'll see you then. In the meantime, be sure to download your tracks. Say thanks to Sweetwater for me. There's a link in the description where you can go shopping, get you some new gear, and be sure to download your tracks so you can mix along with me, completely free, of course. That's it for me. See you next week.